The morning Everett Colborne drove back to Weyburn, Saskatchewan, the sky was the color of old tin, and the fields on either side of the highway looked like something had given up on them a long time ago. He hadn't planned on coming back. Not like this. Everett Colborne was 31 years old, broad across the shoulders, in the way that men who grow up hauling grain get broad, with hands that were already rougher than they had any right to be at his age. His hair was dark brown and cut close on the sides, longer on top where it had started to curl a little from the cold. He had his father's jaw, square and set, and his mother's eyes, which were gray and quiet and missed very little. He'd left Weyburn at 18 to study agronomy at the University of Saskatchewan in Saskatoon, then stayed on afterward working for a soil science consulting firm out of Regina. He'd built a reasonable life there. A small apartment near the university district. A colleague who had become something more than a colleague. A calendar full of soil sample reports and farm advisory visits that kept him busy enough not to think too hard about the farm outside Weyburn, where his father, Rupert Colborne, had spent 43 years of his life trying to grow durum wheat in ground that fought him every single year. Rupert had died in February, a stroke sudden and complete, the way some men go. Here one morning, gone by afternoon. The farm had come to Everett. He almost sold it. He'd had the papers drawn up. A grain operation out of Moose Jaw had offered a fair price, not a great price, but fair, and Everett had held the pen over the signature line for a long time. Then he'd put the pen down, told the agent he needed another week, and driven back to Weyburn instead. He couldn't have explained why, not in any way that would have satisfied the colleagues and friends who asked. He just knew that when he stood in the yard of his father's farm, his farm now, and looked at the north field where the soil had been blowing since October, little dark clouds of it, lifting off the surface whenever the wind picked up, something in him went still and decided. The farm was 480 acres of mixed cropland on the southern edge of the Qu'Appelle region. The soil was dark and should have been productive, but 3 decades of continuous cropping and no attention to windbreaks had left the topsoil thin and restless. The north and west fields were the worst. Every spring, Rupert had watched the seed blow off the surface before it even had a chance to set roots. Some years he'd reseed twice. The neighbors all knew it. It was a quiet kind of embarrassment that Rupert had carried without ever speaking of it directly, and Everett had grown up watching him carry it. He gave his notice to the consulting firm on a Thursday in March, settled what needed settling in Regina, and moved back to Weyburn by the first week of April. His closest neighbor to the east was a man named Wendell Faber, 64 years old, with a red-gray beard and the particular squinting manner of someone who has spent most of his life outdoors judging weather. Wendell ran a cattle and grain operation of about 800 acres and had known Rupert since they were both young men. He came over the first Saturday after Everett moved in, carrying a covered dish from his wife, Darlene, and staying to drink coffee in the kitchen afterward. Wendell asked what Everett planned to do with the place. Everett told him. He had thought it through carefully, drawing on everything he'd absorbed in his agronomy degree and his years of soil consulting. The problem on the Colborne farm wasn't the soil itself. The soil, tested properly, had the minerals and the organic matter to support good yields. The problem was wind erosion. The north and west fields had no protection. Without windbreaks, the topsoil blew in March and April when it was at its driest and most exposed. Without windbreaks, the snow redistribution in winter was all wrong. Most of the snowpack drifted into the ditches along the road instead of settling evenly over the fields, which meant less moisture in the ground come spring. Without windbreaks, the crops that did establish themselves were fighting wind stress all summer, channeling energy into survival instead of grain production. Everett's plan was to plant shelter belts. Not just one row of spruce along the farmyard fence, the way his father had done years ago. A proper multi-row shelter belt system along the north and west edges of the exposed fields, and eventually interior tree rows between the most vulnerable sections. He'd laid it out on graph paper. 4 rows of trees in staggered plantings, beginning with low shrubs on the outermost edge, then working inward through progressively taller species. Green ash and Manitoban maple on the outer rows to handle the first force of the wind. White spruce in the middle rows to provide year-round density. Hybrid poplar on the inner edge for rapid early height. Understory of wolf, willow along the ground to hold soil and support the base. It would take years before any of it made a meaningful difference to the fields. Wendell Faber listened to all of this without interrupting. He drank his coffee slowly. He looked at the graph paper Everett had spread on the kitchen table. Then he set his mug down and rubbed the side of his jaw. "You're going to lose planting area," he said. "A shelter belt, wide enough to do what you're describing, eats into your cultivable acres. I know. Your north field and your west field combined are already your weakest ground. You start pulling rows out of production, you're going to hurt your numbers in the short term. I know that, too." Wendell nodded slowly, the way a man nods when he's already formed an opinion, but is deciding how directly to share it. "Your dad tried a hedgerow on the north field, I think, back in the 90s sometime, 1997, Everett said. Single row of carragana. The municipality spraying program killed part of it in 2001, and the rest died back in the drought." "Right." Wendell picked up his hat from the table. "Well, you know this land." He didn't say he thought it would work. He also didn't say he thought it wouldn't. He just left, carrying his hat, and Everett stood at the window and watched the old red half-ton go down the gravel road. Over the next 3 weeks, word went around. In a small town like Weyburn, population 612, 1 co-op, 1 coffee shop called Patsy's, where the farmers gathered every weekday morning. Word always went around. Everett Colborne was back. Everett Colborne was giving up half his crop acres to plant trees. Everett Colborne, who had a university degree in agronomy and had worked for a consulting firm in Regina, was doing something that didn't make a lick of practical sense to anyone who had to make a mortgage payment from what they grew. A man named Vernon Achterberg, who farmed about 1,100 acres to the northwest and carried strong opinions about most things, said at Patsy's one Thursday morning that it was what happened when you sent a farm kid to university and let him read too many books. A couple of people laughed. Vernon Achterberg was the kind of man whose laughter carried far and gathered others to it. Everett was aware of all of this. Weyburn was not a big place, and he had grown up there. He knew how the coffee shop conversations went. He planted the first trees in May of that year, 2,200 seedlings, mostly green ash and Manitoban maple for the outer rows, ordered through the Saskatchewan agroforestry program. He and a part-time hired hand named Teddy Reimer, 19 years old and mostly quiet, spent 9 days on the planting. The seedlings were small, 6-inch whips of green in dark soil, barely visible from the road. Passable conversation at Patsy's for about a week, and then forgotten. The spring crop that year was average. Durum on the south and east fields, canola on part of the center ground. The north and west fields, stripped of their usual planting rows along the edges, returned what Everett had expected. Less than the year before. He'd known that was coming. It was the first year of a long subtraction before any addition was possible. His mother, Irene Colborne, lived in town now, in the small house on 4th Street that she and Rupert had bought when they'd semi-retired from active farming 5 years before Rupert's death. She was 66 years old, a small, precise woman with white hair she wore, pinned back and eyes that were the same gray as Everett's. She drove out to the farm every second Sunday to have dinner and to see how things were going. She did not offer opinions unless asked, which was one of the things Everett had always valued about her. But one evening in late August, she stood at the kitchen window, looking out toward the north field, where the tree seedlings were invisible in the dying light, and she said quietly, "Your father always felt badly about those fields." Everett said he knew. He didn't know what to do differently, she said. He just kept doing what he knew. Everett said he understood that. She turned from the window. I think you're doing right. I don't know if it will work, but I think you're doing right. That was the only encouragement she offered. It was enough. The second year was harder than the first, and not because of anything to do with the trees. The growing season ran dry from June onward. The canola failed to fill properly. The durum came in thin. Everett's operating loan from the credit union, which he'd taken on to cover the tree planting costs and the farm's running expenses, while he rebuilt its production systems, sat at a number he didn't enjoy looking at. Vernon Achterberg, who had had a reasonable year on his operation, mentioned to several people at Patsy's that Rupert Colborne's boy was going to lose the farm inside 3 years. This was said without malice, in the same tone one might use to predict an early frost. Simply a reading of visible conditions. There was a woman named Patrice Godden who came into Everett's life during this second year. Not romantically, but consequentially. She was 48 years old, ran an independent agricultural consulting business out of Regina, and had been contracted by the municipality to do a soil health survey of several area farms. She came to the Colborne farm in July with a soil probe and a clipboard and an air of direct professional efficiency. She was of medium height, with short, dark hair shot through with silver, and a way of walking across a field that suggested she had spent a great deal of time in fields and was not impressed by most of what she saw. She walked the north field with Everett and looked at the seedlings, which were in their second season now and had put on some growth. The green ash were ankle high. The hybrid poplars were pushing knee height in the better drained sections. She made notes. She asked questions about his planting design, species selection, row spacing, orientation relative to prevailing wind direction. Everett answered each question. She made more notes. At the end of the afternoon, she stood at the edge of the field with her clipboard under her arm and said, "You've oriented these correctly. Most farmers plant a single row and then wonder why they don't work. What you're doing will take time, but the physics are right." He thanked her. She looked at him steadily. "People talking about you in town?" "Some." She nodded once. "They'll stop eventually, either because it works or because they find something more interesting to talk about." She picked up her bag. "Either way, it doesn't change what's true." She left. Everett stood in the field for a while after she'd gone. He couldn't explain exactly what it meant to have someone with real credentials look at what he was doing and confirm that the physics were right. It wasn't that he doubted his plan. His agronomy training and his years of soil consulting had given him a solid basis for believing in it. But knowing something in your mind and standing alone in a struggling field in the second year of a drought are two different kinds of knowing. Patrice Godden's words hadn't changed anything structural. They'd just made it slightly easier to turn off the kitchen light at night and sleep. The trees went into their second winter, with the hybrid poplars at knee height and the green ash beginning to show some real structural branching. Not impressive to look at, especially not to someone driving past on the road. Small and scattered looking. More noticeable to Everett were the changes he could already read in the soil surface along the protected rows. A slight reduction in the wind score patterns he'd documented in photographs each April since his first planting. He had a binder of photographs now, one set per year, taken from the same 6 points around the field. To anyone else, they would have looked like pictures of dirt. To Everett, they were a record. In the third year, Vernon Achterberg's prediction seemed, for a while, to be coming true. A late frost in May wiped out 30% of Everett's canola germination and forced a late reseeding. The reseeded crop came in thin and uneven. The durum on the north field, the field that most needed the windbreak protection that the young trees could not yet fully provide, blew through 2 major wind events in April before the crop was established, scattering seed and lifting the thin topsoil in dark curtains that settled in the ditch along the road. Everett stood at the edge of the field both times and watched it happen. and felt something in his chest that was not quite despair, but was in the same general neighborhood. He sat with his operating numbers in April of that year and understood that he was running out of runway. He called the credit union in Weyburn. He spoke with a loans officer named Karen Bodnar, a careful and not unkind woman who explained with professional clarity that the farm's income history over the past 2.5 years did not support an increase to the operating line, and that the existing balance was approaching a threshold that would require a review of the loan's terms. He hung up the phone and sat at the kitchen table for a long time. The morning light came through the east window and lay across the floor in a long, pale rectangle. Outside, he could hear the wind. He thought about his father. He thought about the years Rupert had sat at this same table. This actual table, scarred along one edge where a tractor part had once slid off a porch railing and gouged it, and looked at his own numbers and found ways to keep going. Rupert had not been an innovative farmer. He'd done things largely the way they'd always been done in this part of the country, and some of those habits had cost him in ways Rupert himself had half understood. But he had stayed. 43 years on this ground. That counted for something, even if it was hard to put into a spreadsheet. Everett went to the bank in person. He brought his documentation. Soil tests, his photographic record, his planting maps, a projection of expected shelterbelt maturity, and the corresponding improvement in topsoil retention that his agronomy training let him calculate with reasonable precision. He also brought a report he'd pulled from Agriculture Canada on the long-term yield improvements associated with multi-row shelterbelt systems on the prairies. The numbers in that report, from study farms in Manitoba and Saskatchewan, showed yield increases of 12 to 31% on wind-exposed fields. Once shelterbelts reached functional maturity, the loans manager who met with him was a man named Douglas Reese, 57 years old, heavier in the way men go heavy after 50, with the deliberate manner of someone who has seen a great deal of agricultural optimism across a desk and remained professionally unmoved by most of it. He looked at Everett's documentation for a long time. Then he said, "Your father banked with us for 31 years. "He did," Everett said. Douglas Reese closed the folder. "I'm going to extend the line, not increase it, extend the term. That buys you another growing season before the review triggers." He looked at Everett directly. "Don't come back asking for more." "I won't." He drove home from Weyburn in early afternoon, the sky very blue and the fields still brown from the spring. He stopped once, at the side of the road, and got out and stood looking at the north field from a distance. From here he could actually see the tree rows. The green ash were over 1 meter tall now, the hybrid poplars taller than that, the white spruce still shorter but dense and dark against the soil. They didn't look like much from the road. He knew that. He also knew that the photographic record showed a measurable reduction in wind score extent along the protected borders. The physics were right. Patrice Godin had said so. His own training said so. He just needed more time. He got back in the truck and drove home. The 4th year was the year things began, very quietly, to shift. Spring was wetter than average. The snowpack over the north field, retained, Everett was certain, partly because the young shelterbelt rows had begun to disrupt the wind patterns enough to hold more snow on the field's surface, instead of letting it all drift to the roadside ditches, melted slowly into the soil through March and early April, instead of running off in a rush. When Everett walked the field in late April, he could feel the difference in the soil moisture under his boots. The wind events in April were the same as every other year, but this time, watching from the field edge, Everett could see a visible difference in the north edge of the field. The soil behind the young tree rows was moving less. Not still, not protected the way it would be in another few years, but measurably less. The durum came in strong that year, the best Northfield yield in the 4 years since he'd taken over. He didn't say anything about this to anyone at first. He photographed it. He recorded it. He pulled his yield records from the granary and compared them to the previous 4 years, and to his father's records from the years before that. The number was there in the data. It wasn't proof. One season was not proof, but it was a beginning. He told his mother at Sunday dinner in October, spreading the yield records on the table beside the pot roast. She looked at them carefully, the way she looked at anything carefully, and then she said, "So the trees are working." "They're starting to," he said. "Give them another 2 or 3 years for full maturity, and we'll really see it." Irene Colborne looked at the records a moment longer, then began serving the pot roast. "Your father would have been interested to see this," she said. It was not quite praise and not quite grief. It was both at once, in the way that the past tends to be when you are talking about someone who is gone. The 4th year also brought something Everett had not expected, other farmers starting to watch. Not many, not openly. Farming culture in the region was not one where people came out and said directly that they had changed their minds, or that they were curious about something they'd previously dismissed. But Everett noticed things. Wendell Faber stopped his truck at the field edge twice in the late summer and looked at the tree rows for a while before driving on. A younger farmer from 2 concessions over, a man in his mid-20s named Brock Sunderland, stopped in at the yard one afternoon in October on the pretext of asking about Everett's grain dryer settings, and spent most of the visit looking at the shelter belt from different angles and asking questions that had nothing to do with grain dryers. Everett answered the questions straightforwardly. He was not a man who trafficked in told you so's. The answer to being right was not to spend energy on the people who had said you were wrong. It was to keep doing the work. The 5th year. By May of the 5th year, the hybrid poplars on the inner rows stood between 4 and 5 meters tall. The white spruce were dense and solid, over 2 meters, forming a wall of dark green along the mid-rows that caught the eye even from the road. The green ash and Manitoban maple on the outer edge had layered into something that looked, finally, like a real windbreak, branched and full and rooted deeply enough to hold. The spring wind events in April moved across the north field and broke against the shelter belt. Everett stood at the south edge of the tree rows during one of the big wind days and felt what the trees did. The pressure of the wind arriving at the outer edge, diffusing through the branches, slowing, releasing on the field side as a fraction of what it had been. Behind the trees, the soil surface was still. The topsoil, dark and accumulated through 5 years of protected winters and slowed springs, lay undisturbed. He did not weep or make any particular gesture. He had known this was coming. He walked the field instead, in the particular quiet that existed on the lee side of a shelter belt on a windy day. A silence that felt almost constructed, held in place by the living wall at the field's edge. Dead leaves from the previous fall lay in drifts along the inner base of the tree rows, breaking down slowly into the soil. The ground there was darker than the open field, more textured, more alive. He thought about his soil consulting days, about all the degraded fields he'd walked in a professional capacity, writing reports that recommended practices the landowners often couldn't afford or couldn't be convinced to implement. He thought about how knowledge and action were 2 different things, and how the distance between them could be very long. He thought about sitting at the kitchen table in the 3rd year with his operating numbers and understanding that he was running out of runway. He thought about his father. He walked back to the yard and started the tractor because there was still work to do. The year the shelter belt fully matured, 5 years after the first seedlings went in. The north field produced the best yield Everett had ever recorded on that ground, and the best yield in his father's records going back to 1987. He had data now, 5 years of photographs, 5 years of yield records, soil tests from each spring showing the organic matter content in the sheltered zones increasing year over year as the leaf litter composted into the surface. He put together a simple presentation and brought it to the Municipal Agricultural Committee in October. Soil data, yield data, a breakdown of the planting costs versus the yield improvements over 5 years. The numbers were not complicated. They were just numbers. He was the last presenter on the agenda that evening. There were 11 people in the room, most of them farmers he'd known his whole life, including Wendell Faber in the second row. And Vernon Achterberg near the back, sitting with his arms folded and the expression of a man who was listening, but hadn't committed to anything yet. Everett went through the data without embellishment. He talked about the wind physics, the way a properly designed multi-row shelter belt reduced wind velocity by up to 70% for a distance 10 times the height of the tallest row. He talked about snow redistribution, the way the tree rows captured and held snowpack over the field instead of allowing it to drift to the roads, increasing soil moisture in the spring by a measurable margin. He talked about leaf litter, the way 5 years of accumulated leaves along the shelter belt base had added organic matter and improved soil structure in the protected zones in ways that were showing up clearly in the soil tests. He talked about what had happened to his north field yields. He finished. There was quiet for a moment. Then Wendell Faber said, from the second row, "What species did you use on the outer row again?" And the questions came, not from everyone. Vernon Achterberg sat with his arms still folded and said nothing, though Everett noticed his posture had changed slightly, less closed than it had been when the presentation started. A few of the older farmers asked questions that were more skeptical in tone, the natural skepticism of people who have seen a great many promising ideas come and go over 40 years of farming. But Brock Sunderland, the young farmer from 2 concessions over, who had come to ask about grain dryer settings, and spent the whole visit looking at the trees, raised his hand and asked how much it would cost to get a shelter belt plan, designed for a field with similar exposure characteristics to Everett's north ground. Everett told him. He also told him about the Saskatchewan agroforestry program, the government cost-sharing that had offset a significant portion of his seedling costs. He mentioned Patrice Godden's consulting firm and said she was worth calling for a site assessment. He drove home from the municipal meeting that night on the dark gravel road, the headlights picking out the shoulders of the road and the dark shapes of the fields on either side. He wasn't thinking about Vernon Achterberg or the coffee shop or the things that had been said in the years when the trees were small. He was thinking about the north field, about the soil surface lying still and dark behind the shelter belts on a windy day, about the drifts of composting leaves along the inner base of the ash rows, about the yield numbers in his binder. He turned in at the farm lane and cut the engine in the yard. The night was cold and very still, the way late October gets in Saskatchewan when the season has finally released its last hold. He sat in the dark truck for a while. Overhead, stars covered everything. Out past the yard, the shelter belt on the north field was a solid dark line against the lighter sky, 5 years old now and as rooted as anything on the place. In the spring there would be work to do, maintenance pruning on the lower branches of the green ash, a few gaps in the outer row where seedlings hadn't taken and needed to be filled, soil sampling again along the protected zones. Always more work. He was not a man who spent much time on regret, or on vindication, or on the long list of things people had said when the trees were still 6-inch whips in dark soil. He was a farmer. The work was the work, and the ground was the ground, and what the ground showed you after 5 years of patience was not a trophy. It was a direction. He got out of the truck. The cold air smelled of late grass and turned soil and, faintly, of the spruce rows on the north edge, that particular clean resin smell that the trees threw off on cold nights, carrying across the yard in the dark. He went inside, put the kettle on, and sat down at the kitchen table, the same table scarred along one edge, and wrote in his field notebook, Northfield, October. Everything where it should be. Tomorrow, check moisture sensors, review spring plan. Outside in the dark, the trees stood in their rows and held the ground.